My sister and I came home early to hear my girlfriend coaching her sister. Want to know how I got my boyfriend's uncle to pay for my MBA? My sister grabbed my arm, stopping me in the hallway. Through the doorway, we could hear my girlfriend talking to her younger sister. Uncle Robert refused to pay for my college, she said, so I fixed that. Her sister asked how. Easy. I coached Katie on what to say happened at that Christmas party. My blood went cold. Katie was her cousin. She was 6 years old back then. Look, I documented everything, my girlfriend said, pulling out her phone. Here's the coaching text I wrote out for Katie. It happened during hide and seek in the closet. Point to the doll's privates when they ask where. She scrolled more. I wrote her entire testimony. He said it was a special game. He touched my underwear. She then chuckled like she was proud of herself. 6-year-olds don't talk like that naturally. You have to practice it with them over and over until they believe it themselves. Her sister looked sick. You brainwashed Katie? Successfully. Look at this. She then pulled something up on her phone. Wire transfer. $200,000 from Robert Wade. She chuckled like she was proud of herself. This is how you know you did a good job. Look at Katie's therapy intake from last month. Patient 14. Self-hurts due to childhood trauma. She laughed again. Perfect victim. Her whole personality formed around something that never happened. That trauma bought our house and my MBA. I burst through the door, and my sister followed behind, tucking her police badge in her pocket that my girlfriend knew nothing about. You destroyed my uncle's life with a lie? I snapped. My girlfriend spun around, face draining of color. How long have you— Robert took his life. The words came out cold and steady. 2 years ago. Left a note saying he couldn't live with everyone thinking he was a creeper. I didn't know he would what? Only suffer forever instead of dying? I stepped closer, watching her back against the wall. His daughter believed you. She's the one who told him to stay away from her kids. He never met his grandchildren because his own daughter thought he was dangerous. My girlfriend's hands started shaking. That's not my fault. You literally created the lie that killed him. My sister stepped into view, her presence making my girlfriend shrink further. Your cousin Katie harms herself, and you're proud of that? My girlfriend went even paler. My family tore itself apart, I said. My Aunt Linda still sends Robert's widow apology letters for defending him. My Uncle James won't speak to her for not defending him. Cousins choosing sides at every holiday. You know what my grandmother's last words were? At least Robert can't hurt any more children. She died believing her son was a monster. I was young. I didn't think— My girlfriend tried. You were 22 with a spreadsheet of lies. I cut her off. You just showed us the text where you coached a kindergartner. The youth center, I continued, watching her sink into a chair. 400 kids lost their after-school program when Robert's reputation destroyed it. The sewer slide hotline he funded shut down. How many kids didn't get help because you wanted tuition money? She was visibly trembling now. It was just supposed to be money. From a man whose reputation you destroyed. My mother hasn't slept through the night in 4 years. She defended her brother-in-law and lost her entire book club, her church friends. They called her an enabler. My sister added quietly. The forensic interview videos of Katie are evidence. A 6-year-old describing assault you invented. That's federal. My girlfriend looked desperately between us. You can't prove— You just showed my sister your proof, I said. The texts coaching Katie, the bank transfers, the lawyer's emails. You documented your own crimes. The proposal, I laughed bitterly. You let me propose in the house Robert paid for, with a ring his death bought, while visiting his grave to pay respects. You watched me cry at his headstone knowing you killed him. His son Marcus dropped out of MIT to support his mom, I continued. She gave Robert everything in the divorce to protect their kids from the molester. 3 jobs at 60 years old because of your lies. My girlfriend was sobbing now, looking so small. Please what? Don't tell Katie her entire trauma is fiction. Don't tell Robert's family he died innocent. Don't report the federal crime you just confessed to. My girlfriend stood to leave, legs shaking. I need to go. Sit down, my sister said quietly, pulling out her phone. The police academy graduation photo on the hallway table suddenly made sense to my girlfriend. You're a cop? Her voice cracked. Detective Wade. Graduated last week. My sister's voice was steady. Everything you just said about coaching Katie, the extortion, the wire fraud, all recorded. But he said you got a new job in sales. I never said sales. You never asked. I stepped back. You made a 6-year-old believe she was molested. You drove an innocent man to sewer slide. My sister was already dialing. Katie's about to learn her whole trauma was a lie. Robert's family is about to learn he died innocent. And you're about to learn what real consequences feel like. But there was something we didn't know about Kimberly, and it's that people like her always have a plan B. Kimberly's face went from pale to ghost white when she realized what my sister being a cop meant for her, and she started backing toward the door real fast while mumbling something about needing to leave right now to take care of something important. My sister moved quick and blocked the doorway with her body, telling Kimberly she needed to stay put while we sorted this whole mess out properly. Kimberly's eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal looking for another exit, but there wasn't one. My sister pulled out her phone and started recording, explaining to Kimberly that this was now a formal matter that needed proper documentation for the investigation. She pointed at me and told me to sit down on the couch and not touch anything while she called her supervisor to report what just happened. I watched Kimberly's hands shake as she realized how bad this was getting for her. Without warning, Kimberly lunged across the room for her own phone sitting on the coffee table, but I was closer and grabbed it first, holding it up high away from her reach. She started crying hard and begging me to give it back, saying she needed to delete something important right now before it was too late. My sister took the phone from my hand and told Kimberly it was evidence now, and she needed to stop trying to destroy anything, or it would only make things worse for her. She dialed her supervisor while keeping one eye on Kimberly, explaining she needed backup at our location because of a confession involving a federal crime against a minor. Kaylee, who had been frozen in the corner this whole time, looked like she might throw up as she whispered that Kimberly had told her about a backup plan if she ever got caught for this. She said there was something scheduled to send automatically from Kimberly's computer if she didn't stop it in time, something that would hurt more people. I couldn't hold back anymore and told them what they didn't know yet, that Robert had taken his own life 2 years ago, that he left a note saying he couldn't live with everyone believing he hurt a child when he never did. Kimberly stumbled backward into a chair like I'd punched her in the stomach, her hands shaking worse now as the reality of what she'd caused finally hit her. My sister kept her professional composure, but I could see her jaw clenching tight as she told Kimberly to remain seated and not to delete anything from any device she had access to. She stepped into the hall hallway to make another call, but stayed where she could see us through the doorway, probably calling for more backup or maybe the district attorney's office. Kimberly tried to stand up again, her voice getting louder as she said she had rights and didn't have to stay here without a lawyer present. My sister came back into the room and calmly explained that while she wasn't under arrest yet, leaving would be extremely unwise given what she'd just confessed to on a recording. I pulled out my phone and sent a quick text to my cousin, who lived near Robert's widow, asking them to go check on her before any of this became public knowledge through social media or gossip. I knew she deserved to hear the truth about her husband, but not through some random post or text message from a stranger. About 45 minutes later, 2 detectives in plain clothes showed up at the house, and my sister formally recused herself from the investigation, but explained she would stay as a witness to what happened. They asked Kimberly if she would consent to them securing her phone as evidence, and after they explained the alternative involved getting a warrant which would take longer and look worse for her, she reluctantly agreed. The detectives put on gloves and carefully placed Kimberly's phone in an evidence bag, while one of them started taking our statements about what we'd heard and seen. Kimberly's face drained of all remaining color as she watched them handle the phone that she knew contained all the proof of her crimes against Robert and Katie. Kaylee pulled me aside while the detectives were talking to Kimberly and whispered that her sister had mentioned something about emails set to send to our whole family if she didn't log in every few days. She said the emails would claim I forced Kimberly to make up the whole story about Robert, that I was the real villain here trying to protect a child molester in the family. Her voice shook as she admitted she was terrified of what else her sister might have planned as insurance against getting caught. My phone started ringing, and it was my mother, crying because she'd just heard from another relative that something was happening with Robert's case and the police were involved. I told her I couldn't explain everything yet, but that Robert was innocent. We had proof now, and everything was going to come out soon. What a shocking turn of events. My heart is racing as Kimberly's evil plan comes crashing down around her. The way she coached little Katie with those awful lies makes me so angry, but seeing her finally face justice is incredible. The detectives conducted a preliminary interview with Kimberly right there in our living room, where she admitted to coaching Katie, but kept claiming she never meant for Robert to kill himself, that it wasn't supposed to go that far. Her voice cracked as she insisted she was just desperate for money to pay for school and didn't think about all the consequences that would follow. Kaylee stepped forward and told the detectives about how their family had been struggling with money for years after their dad lost his job at the factory. She explained that Kimberly saw Robert's big house and fancy cars and started talking about how unfair it was that some people had so much while they had nothing. The detective taking notes looked up when Kaylee mentioned that Kimberly had researched false accusation cases online for months before picking Katie as the perfect victim. She showed them screenshots from Kimberly's search history that she'd saved on her own phone. Searches like coaching child testimony and how to make accusations stick, dated 6 months before the Christmas party. Her hands shook as she scrolled through the evidence, admitting she knew something was wrong when Kimberly started practicing stories with Katie, but was too scared to speak up. The detectives spent another 2 hours going through everything, asking follow-up questions and taking photos of documents on Kaylee's phone. Finally, around midnight, they told Kimberly she was free to go pending further investigation, but couldn't leave town and should expect charges soon. They handed her a paper with instructions about not contacting witnesses or destroying evidence. Kimberly's face was completely blank as she pulled out her phone and called someone for a ride, and I heard her tell them she needed a lawyer right away, a good one who handled federal cases. The detectives packed up their evidence bags and recording equipment while my sister stayed behind to make sure everything was documented properly. The next morning, my sister sat at her desk filling out her official report, being careful to note her recusal from the active investigation while documenting everything she'd witnessed as a civilian. She told me the case looked solid, based on the evidence, but warned this would be a long process with no guarantees since these kinds of cases were complicated. Her phone rang, and it was Jake Bernard from the district attorney's office, asking for all the preliminary documentation from the confession. She put him on speaker, and he sounded interested but cautious, explaining they needed to build an airtight case given how sensitive false accusation cases were. He asked detailed questions about the recording quality and whether Kimberly had been read her rights, seeming satisfied when my sister explained she wasn't in custody at the time of the confession. After the call, I picked up my phone to call Marcus, Robert's son, but when I got his voicemail I just hung up because I didn't know how to explain this in a message. The weight of having to tell him his father died innocent felt crushing, knowing it would open up all those old wounds about the suicide. I kept picking up the phone and putting it down, writing and deleting texts, not knowing how to start that conversation. Meanwhile, Kaylee was going through Kimberly's room while she was gone and found more evidence hidden in a shoebox under the bed. She texted me photos of handwritten notes where Kimberly had practiced Katie's testimony, complete with corrections and arrows showing which words to emphasize. There were also printed articles about similar cases, with parts highlighted about how to avoid getting caught. Kaylee was terrified her sister would try to get back at her for talking to the police, so she decided to send everything to an anonymous tip line the detectives had mentioned. She took photos of all the planning documents, the practice scripts, and even a timeline Kimberly had made showing when to coach Katie for maximum impact. She included details about the coaching sessions she'd personally witnessed, times when Kimberly would sit with Katie for hours going over the story until the little girl could tell it perfectly. The tip line confirmed they received everything and would forward it to the investigators working the case. 2 days later, the detectives called my sister to update her on the case, even though she was officially recused, and she put them on speaker so I could hear that they'd gotten a judge to sign off on a subpoena for Kimberly's bank records. They explained that financial crimes like this always leave a paper trail that's basically impossible to hide once you start looking for it, and the wire transfer would show exactly when and how Robert sent that money. My sister took notes while they talked about how these cases work, how the money moving from one account to another creates records at multiple banks that all have to match up. The next morning, Jake Bernard from the district attorney's office came by to review all the evidence with my sister, and even though she couldn't work the case directly, he wanted her input on what she'd witnessed. He spread out copies of the texts, the bank transfer screenshot, and transcripts strips of the recording across our dining room table, pointing at each piece as he explained the charges he was considering. Wire fraud was the big one, since the money crossed state lines when it went from Robert's credit union to Kimberly's bank, and that made it federal, which meant serious prison time. He also mentioned extortion, since she basically blackmailed Robert with the false accusations, and conspiracy involving a minor, because she used Katie to commit the crimes. My sister asked about the recording, and whether it would hold up in court, and Jake seemed confident it would, since Kimberly wasn't in custody when she confessed, and nobody forced her to talk. That night, after everyone left, I sat alone in my room playing the recording of Kimberly's confession on my phone, listening to her laugh about destroying Robert's life like it was some clever joke. My hands started shaking, and I wanted to throw my phone against the wall so bad I could feel my arm tensing up, but I forced myself to put it down and take deep breaths, because getting angry wouldn't help Robert now. The only thing that might honor his memory was making sure justice actually happened this time. The next day, Jake's office sent out a memo to everyone involved in the case about their media strategy, which basically meant nobody was supposed to talk to reporters or post anything online about what was happening. He explained during a conference call that once this became public, everyone would have opinions, and the last thing they needed was potential jurors seeing a bunch of stuff on social media that could mess up the trial. Meanwhile, the detectives were working on the Katie situation, trying to figure out how to handle her involvement without making things worse for a kid who already believed she'd been hurt. They reached out through official channels to the therapist, who'd been treating Katie for her trauma, explaining they needed to discuss her patient, but being careful not to reveal too much over the phone. The therapist agreed to meet with them in person, and from what my sister heard later, she was shocked, but also worried about how Katie would handle learning the truth. A week passed before we heard that Kimberly had hired a defense attorney, who immediately started filing motions to get evidence thrown out. The big one was challenging the recording of her confession, arguing that my sister should have read her Miranda rights before recording anything, since she was a cop. Jake called us right after the motion was filed, and he didn't sound worried at all, explaining that Miranda only applies when someone's in custody and being interrogated by police. Since Kimberly was in her own home talking freely to people she knew personally, and my sister wasn't there in an official capacity, the recording should be fine. That same afternoon, Kaylee showed up at my door looking scared and asked if we could talk privately. She pulled me into the backyard and whispered that Kimberly had told her about a backup plan months ago, something about emails that were set to send automatically if anything ever happened to her. According to Kaylee, these emails would go to my whole family, my job, and even the police, claiming that I forced Kimberly to make up the story about Robert and threatened her if she didn't go along with it. Kaylee knew where Kimberly kept her laptop password, written down in a notebook, and she thought maybe we could stop the emails before they sent. I immediately called the detectives and told them everything Kaylee had just told me, and they took it seriously, getting a warrant that same day to access Kimberly's cloud storage and email accounts. The tech team worked through the night and found the scheduled emails exactly where Kaylee said they'd be, set to send in 3 days if Kimberly didn't log in to cancel them. They documented everything, taking screenshots of each email in the scheduling settings, then canceled them all while making sure to preserve the evidence of what she'd tried to do. Jake later told us this was huge because it showed consciousness of guilt and an attempt to obstruct justice by framing me for her crimes. About 2 weeks after the investigation started, the bank records finally came back from the subpoena, and they confirmed everything. The wire transfer of exactly $200,000 went from Robert's account to Kimberly's just 2 months before he killed himself. And the paper trail showed she used it for the down payment on the house we'd been living in, and her MBA tuition, just like she'd bragged about. The records even showed Robert had to take out a loan against his retirement to get the money, which made it even worse knowing he destroyed his future for a lie. I knew I had to tell Robert's widow before she heard it from someone else or saw it in the news, so I drove to her apartment that evening with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. This evidence pile is growing huge. Kimberly wrote practice scripts for Katie and made a whole timeline. She planned this for months, plus those backup emails trying to frame the narrator show she knew she might get caught. She answered the door looking tired from another long shift at one of her 3 jobs, and when she saw my face, she knew something big had happened. We sat at her small kitchen table, and I told her everything, watching her face change from confusion to shock to this deep sadness as she processed that her husband had died innocent. She started crying and asked me why Katie would say those things if they weren't true, and I had to explain how Kimberly coached her, how a 6-year-old can be taught to believe something that never happened. She held my hand across the table for a long moment before asking if the police knew about all this, and I told her they did, and that Jake Bernard from the district attorney's office was handling it personally. The next morning, Jake called Kaylee in for a formal interview at the courthouse downtown, where she spent 3 hours going through everything she'd witnessed. She showed him dates in her calendar app where she'd marked when Kimberly made her practice with Katie, and she remembered specific phrases Kimberly used, like telling Katie to say it tickled when they asked how it felt. Jake took notes on everything, and had Kaylee sign a sworn statement that matched up perfectly with the coaching texts we'd already recovered from Kimberly's phone. 2 days later, a woman named Sylvia Laurent joined the investigation team as a specialist in false memory cases involving children. She sat down with Jake and my sister to explain that Katie genuinely believed these memories were real now, because young brains can't always tell the difference between something that happened and something they were taught happened. She stressed that we couldn't just tell Katie the truth all at once, because it could cause serious psychological damage to suddenly learn her entire identity as a trauma survivor was based on a lie. Jake pulled up the original forensic interview videos from 8 years ago, when Katie was 6, and we all watched them together in his office. The interviewer asked Katie to describe what happened, and she used words like inappropriate touching, and private areas that no 6-year-old would naturally say without being coached. Jake shook his head and pointed out how Katie kept looking off camera, like she was checking if she was saying it right, and you could see her counting on her fingers when she listed the 3 times it supposedly happened. The language matched Kimberly's coaching text word for word in some places, especially when Katie said, "He told me it was our special secret," which was exactly what Kimberly had written in her notes. That afternoon, we got word that Kimberly's lawyer was already trying to build a defense, claiming she'd been been manipulated by an older relative into making up the accusations against Robert. Jake called me right away and said this was a common tactic, but it wouldn't work because we had proof she planned everything herself, including the spreadsheet tracking her coaching sessions with Katie. The ethics team met the next day to figure out how to handle Katie's involvement without causing more harm to a kid who'd already been through enough, even if the trauma wasn't real. They decided to work with Katie's current therapist to slowly explore inconsistencies in her memories over several months rather than shocking her with the truth all at once. Sylvia Laurent would supervise the process and make sure Katie had proper support as she gradually came to understand what really happened or didn't happen in this case. My phone started blowing up with angry texts from cousins and aunts who'd heard rumors about the investigation and thought I was trying to clear Robert's name just to get inheritance money. One cousin wrote that I was disrespecting victims everywhere by questioning Katie's story, and another said I should be ashamed for defending a child molester even after his death. My aunt sent a long message about how she'd seen the signs with Robert and knew something was off about him, and she couldn't believe I was trying to rewrite history now that he was gone. The family group chat turned into a war zone, with people taking sides and some relatives blocking each other over whether to believe the new evidence or stick with what they'd believed for years. 3 days later, Kaylee showed up at the police station with a small black phone she'd found hidden in a shoebox in Kimberly's closet while packing up her sister's things. She handed it to the detectives and told them she'd listened to some of the recordings on it, and they needed to hear them immediately. The phone had dozens of audio files of Kimberly practicing with Katie, and you could hear her correcting the little girl when she got details wrong about the supposed assault. In one recording, Kimberly said, "No, sweetie, remember you have to say he touched your underwear, not your pants," and Katie's small voice repeated it back perfectly. Another recording had Kimberly going through the timeline with Katie over and over until the 6-year-old could recite exactly when and where each incident supposedly happened during that Christmas party. The digital forensics team took the phone and started extracting everything, including deleted files that Kimberly thought were gone forever. They found voice memos from right after she got the money, where she was laughing and saying she couldn't believe how easy it was to fool everyone, including the forensic interviewer. In one deleted memo, she joked about how Robert's family was so quick to believe it because he was always the weird, quiet uncle who spent too much time with kids at his youth center. She even celebrated buying her house with what she called easy money from a creepy old man who had it coming anyway, which made me want to throw something at the wall. Sylvia Laurent came to my apartment that evening to explain what we were dealing with regarding Katie's situation going forward. She said Katie would probably resist accepting the truth at first because her whole identity for the past 8 years had been built around being a survivor of childhood trauma. She'd gone to support groups and therapy and learned to see herself as strong for overcoming what happened to her, so learning it was all fake would destroy her sense of self. Sylvia warned us that healing from false memories could be just as hard as healing from real trauma because the brain doesn't really know the difference once the memories are established. She said Katie might need years of therapy to rebuild her identity and learn to trust her own memories again after this revelation. The next morning, Jake Bernard made the decision to file initial charges for wire fraud and extortion while they continued building the larger case around the false accusations. He explained this strategy would give them leverage for a plea deal while also protecting Katie from being dragged through a public trial about whether her trauma was real or not. 2 weeks later, Kimberly's lawyer filed papers with the court trying to get all the phone evidence thrown out. He argued that my sister had recorded it without a warrant, and that made it illegal to use in court. Jake called me that afternoon and told me not to worry because this was totally normal for defense lawyers to try. He said the judge would probably deny it since Kimberly wasn't under arrest when she confessed, and nobody forced her to show us the evidence. The hearing got scheduled for 3 weeks out, which meant more waiting and wondering if she'd somehow get away with everything. That night, I sat at my desk and started writing a letter to Katie that I knew I'd never actually send her. I wrote about how sorry I was that she got used as a weapon in someone else's war against an innocent man. I told her it wasn't her fault and that she deserved better than being turned into a tool for extortion. I wrote about how brave she was for surviving all these years with memories that felt real, even though they weren't. The letter ended up being 4 pages long, and I folded it up and put it in my desk drawer. It felt important to write it, even if she'd never read it, because someday, maybe I'd find the right way to help her understand. Meanwhile, Internal Affairs started looking into my sister's involvement to make sure she'd followed all the rules about stepping back from the case. They interviewed her for 3 hours about exactly when she realized this involved our family and what steps she took to recuse herself. She had to turn over all her notes and recordings to prove she hadn't tried to influence the investigation after handing it off. A week later, they cleared her completely and said she'd done everything by the book, which was a huge relief. She told me later that those 3 hours of questioning were some of the most stressful of her life. She kept second-guessing whether she'd done everything right and worrying they'd find some tiny mistake that would mess up the whole case. Kaylee called me the next day with her voice shaking and asked if she could come over right away. She showed up 20 minutes later carrying a manila folder and looking like she hadn't slept in days. She handed me the folder, and inside was a printed document dated 3 weeks before our confrontation with Kimberly. It was a statement blaming me for forcing her to make up the story about Robert. The document said I'd threatened her and made her coach Katie because I wanted Robert's money for myself. It claimed I was the real villain, and she was just another victim trying to protect herself from my abuse. Kaylee said she found it on Kimberly's laptop when she was looking for something else and made a copy before Kimberly could delete it. She was terrified her sister would find out she'd taken it, but knew the investigators needed to see it. I drove her straight to the police station where she gave them the document and showed them exactly where she'd found it on the computer. The detectives took the document and started analyzing all the computer data to figure out when it was really created. They found metadata showing the file was first written 23 days before our confrontation, which completely destroyed any claim that I'd forced her to do anything. The phone evidence is incredible. Katie's little voice repeating those coached lines breaks my heart. Hearing a 6-year-old practice saying, "He touched your underwear when nothing happened," is just heartbreaking proof of how Kimberly manipulated her own daughter for money. Jake called called me that afternoon and said this was huge because it showed clear planning and what lawyers call consciousness of guilt. He said no innocent person writes a backup lie 3 weeks before they supposedly get caught. The metadata also showed she'd edited it 6 times over those 3 weeks, which meant she'd been perfecting her escape plan for almost a month. Jake set up a meeting with Robert's widow the following week to talk about making a statement once the charges were official. She agreed to meet at a coffee shop near her apartment and showed up looking tired but determined. Jake explained that clearing Robert's name publicly would help, but they needed to time it right to avoid messing up the legal case. She said she'd wait as long as needed, but wanted the world to know her husband died innocent. She started crying when she talked about how their grandkids still thought their grandfather was a bad man. Jake promised her they'd make sure everyone knew the truth when the time was right. 3 days later, Kaylee called me panicking because one of Kimberly's friends had contacted her on social media. The friend said Kimberly wanted to talk to her about getting their stories straight before anything else happened. Kaylee was smart enough to record the whole conversation on her phone while pretending to go along with it. The friend kept saying they needed to meet in person to discuss what they'd tell the police if asked. Kaylee said she was too scared to meet and hung up, then immediately called the investigators to report it. They told her she'd done exactly the right thing and took the recording as more evidence of witness tampering. Meanwhile, Sylvia had started working with Katie on a new therapy approach that wouldn't directly challenge her memories. She explained to me that they were exploring how memories work in general and helping Katie understand that sometimes our brains fill in gaps. The goal was to help Katie slowly realize on her own that some details might not be exactly as she remembered. Sylvia said this would take months of careful work, but it was the safest way to help Katie without causing more trauma. I spent the next weekend going through our house and removing everything that Robert's money had bought. The flat screen TV went in the garage along with the new furniture and kitchen appliances we'd gotten after Kimberly got the money. I took off the engagement ring and put it in a box to sell later. Every item felt dirty, knowing it came from destroying an innocent man's life. I decided to sell everything and donate the money to the youth programs Robert used to run before his reputation got destroyed. It seemed like the only decent thing to do with blood money. The following Monday, Jake called to say he was filing formal charges against Kimberly for wire fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit fraud involving a minor. The arrest warrant would be issued for early Tuesday morning with instructions to handle everything as quietly as possible to protect Katie. The detectives showed up at Kimberly's parents' house at 6 in the morning while I waited in my car down the street. Through the window, I could see her mother answer the door in her bathrobe and then start shaking her head as they showed their badges. Kimberly came downstairs still in pajamas, and the officers put her in handcuffs right there in the living room while her parents stood frozen. They walked her out to the squad car, and I watched her looking around like she couldn't believe this was really happening. At the same time, Kaylee was at the police station giving another statement about everything she'd witnessed and the documents she'd found. The detectives processed Kimberly at the county jail where they took her fingerprints and mugshot and charged her with wire fraud, extortion, and conspiracy involving a minor. The booking officer told her these were federal charges that could mean 20 to 30 years in prison if convicted. 2 days later at the bail hearing, Jake Bernard stood up and explained to the judge that Kimberly had already tried to destroy evidence and contact witnesses through third parties. He showed the judge the emails she'd scheduled to send and the friend who'd contacted Kaylee trying to coordinate stories. The judge set bail at $500,000 and issued a protective order that banned Kimberly from contacting any witnesses, including her own sister. Her lawyer approached Jake after the hearing and mentioned they might be open to discussing a plea deal if the prosecution would consider limiting charges related to Katie's involvement. Jake told him they'd think about it, but only if Kimberly fully admitted to the false accusations and paid full restitution to everyone affected. I drove out to see Robert's daughter the next week and found her sitting in her kitchen surrounded by old photo albums. She kept shaking her head and saying she didn't know what to believe anymore because she'd spent 8 years thinking her father was dangerous. Tears ran down her face as she looked at pictures of Robert holding her as a baby, and she kept asking how she could have believed something so horrible about him. She said she needed time to process everything and couldn't just flip a switch and suddenly see him as innocent after all these years of thinking he was a monster. Meanwhile, Sylvia Laurent started working with Katie in therapy sessions that focused entirely on making her feel safe and building trust without mentioning the false memories at all. She explained to us afterward that rushing this process could make Katie retreat deeper into the false memories as a defense mechanism. The sessions had to move incredibly slowly with Sylvia, just talking about normal teenage things and gradually building a relationship where Katie felt comfortable. 3 weeks after the arrest, the community board that had shut down Robert's youth center held an emergency meeting to discuss potentially reopening it if they could find new funding. Several board members stood up and expressed deep regret for abandoning the program based on accusations they now knew were false. One woman who'd led the charge to close it broke down crying and said she'd helped destroy something beautiful that had helped hundreds of kids. They voted to start a fundraising campaign to reopen the center and name it after Robert to honor his memory. Around this time, Kimberly's lawyer presented a stipulation where she'd admit to coaching Katie and receiving the $200,000 through extortion. The catch was her lawyer wouldn't let her state definitively that the abuse never happened because Katie still believed the memories were real. Jake recognized they couldn't prove the negative without putting Katie through more trauma by having her testify about memories she believed were true. He agreed to focus on the financial crimes, which still carried serious prison time and would result in Robert's name being cleared in the public record. I went to a family gathering at my aunt's house where she'd invited everyone to hear the truth about Robert. Some relatives sat quietly and accepted the evidence, while others got angry and stormed out, refusing to believe they'd been wrong all these years. My cousin stood up and yelled that we were trying to protect a dead pedophile and slammed the door so hard a picture fell off the wall. The wounds in our family ran too deep for instant healing, but at least the truth was finally being spoken out loud. During all this, Kaylee moved in with a supportive aunt for her own safety after getting threatening messages from Kimberly's friends. Before she left, she gave investigators a spreadsheet she'd found on Kimberly's laptop that detailed the entire coaching timeline for Katie. The spreadsheet had dates and times of practice sessions and notes about which details Katie was having trouble remembering correctly. Kaylee seemed relieved to be away from the chaos, but you could see the grief in her eyes for the family she thought she had. She told me she felt like she'd lost her sister twice, once when she found out what Kimberly did, and again when she had to testify against her. The preliminary hearing came 3 weeks later, and I sat in the courtroom watching Kimberly in her orange jumpsuit while the judge reviewed the evidence Jake presented. The judge spent 40 minutes going through the coaching texts, the bank records, and the recorded confession before ruling. There was probable cause for all charges, including wire fraud, extortion, and conspiracy involving a minor. Jake told me afterward that some evidence about Katie would be restricted to protect her, but the financial crimes alone could put Kimberly away for decades. That same week, Sylvia called with an update about Katie's therapy sessions and said something interesting was happening. Katie had started questioning small details in her memories during their talks, like wondering why she could remember the closet being blue when it was actually white, and why she remembered it happening at night when the party was during the day. Sylvia explained this was a positive sign, but emphasized it would take many more months of careful work before Katie could safely process the full truth about what Kimberly had done to her. 2 days later, Jake called me about a potential plea deal where Kimberly would admit to fraud and extortion, pay full restitution of $400,000, and serve 8 years in prison. The deal also required her to pay for Katie's ongoing therapy costs and contribute $100,000 to reopening the youth center that had closed because of Robert's destroyed reputation. I spent the next week working with Robert's widow to create a memorial statement that would clear his name without attacking Katie or revealing her identity, since she was still a victim too. We focused on his legacy of helping children through the youth programs he funded and the tragedy of false accusations destroying innocent lives. Kimberly getting arrested in her pajamas at 6 in the morning is such a powerful moment. The way her parents just stood there frozen while she got handcuffed shows how shocked they were by their daughter's crimes. The statement talked about the 400 kids who lost their after-school programs and the hotline that shut down when donations dried up after the accusations. Robert's widow cried as we wrote about how he never got to meet his grandchildren and how his last note said he couldn't bear people thinking he would hurt a child. The court accepted the plea deal 2 weeks later, with Kimberly standing before the judge, admitting she coached Katie to lie about Robert for money and that her lies directly caused his death. The judge sentenced her to 8 years in state prison and ordered her to pay $400,000 in restitution split between Robert's widow Katie's therapy fund and the youth center restoration. I watched Kimberly's parents leave the courtroom looking broken, while Kaylee sat next to me squeezing my hand as her sister was led away in chains. The community board met the following month to vote on reopening the youth center using the restitution money plus donations that started pouring in once people learned the truth about Robert. Board members who had voted to close it stood up one by one, expressing regret and pledging personal donations to make things right. They voted unanimously to name it the Robert Wade Center for Youth Development, and several local businesses offered to sponsor programs in his memory. A week before the center reopened, our family gathered at Robert's grave for the first time since learning the truth. My Aunt Linda placed flowers while crying and apologizing for not defending him harder, while my Uncle James stood silent with tears running down his face. Some cousins who had taken sides against Robert whispered apologies to his headstone, while others just stood there processing that they had abandoned an innocent man. Robert's widow knelt by the grave and whispered that everyone finally knew he was a good man, and that the children he wanted to help would get that help again. Marcus flew in from California, where he'd moved after dropping out of MIT, and hugged his mother as she told the headstone that their family's name was cleared. The moment felt heavy, but necessary, as people faced what their rush to judgment had cost. 6 months passed, and life started finding a new rhythm, with Kaylee thriving in therapy and starting community college with a scholarship from a foundation that helps crime victims. Katie continued working with Sylvia twice a week, slowly unraveling the false memories Kimberly had planted, though Sylvia said it would take years to fully heal from what was done to her mind. I started a foundation called Truth After Trauma to help other families destroyed by false accusations, using the money from selling the ring and house Kimberly bought with Robert's blood money. 3 families reached out in the first month alone, all dealing with similar situations where lies had torn their lives apart. The youth center reopened with 300 kids signing up the first week, and Marcus agreed to join the board to continue his father's legacy. The truth didn't undo the damage or bring Robert back, but it opened the door for real healing to finally begin after years of festering wounds built on lies. What an incredible journey this has been. Thanks so much for letting me share all these big feelings with you. And hey, if you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.